As we talk about our lesson for today, I want you to prepare or recall the real-life experiment that you just submitted to me. If you remember one of your assignments in experimental psychology lab, I asked you to do a real-life experiment on your own. So, ang gagawin nyo lang for this lecture is I would like you to go back to that experiment. Just recall what did you do in the experiment and what happened to that experiment. Kasi babalik-balikan natin yung assignment na yan for today's lesson. For today, we are going to talk about the difference between true experiments and quasi experiments. If you are going to collect all psychological experiments in the world, you can say na pwede mo silang magrupo sa dalawa. Merong ibang true experiments, may mga experiments naman na quasi experiments. So, given that, I am going to teach you two skills. Number one, ano pinagkaiba or how can you know if an experiment is a true experiment or is it a quasi-experiment? And more importantly, number two, I am going to teach you to justify why. Dapat alam nyo rin what makes a true experiment and a quasi-experiment a quasi-experiment. Let's first talk about true experiment. Bibigyan ko kayo ng isang halimbawa ng isang experiment considered to be a true experiment. Let's say, for example, merong dinedevelop na pill. It's called the knowledge pill. This pill is very amazing because when you take this pill, it will increase your knowledge. Ibig sabihin na to, there's no need to study very hard. All you need to do is to take this pill, and this pill will help you understand the difficult concepts na pinag-aaralan mo sa school. Now, to make the long story short, let's say in the laboratory, this pill is already proven to increase knowledge. So, the issue here is the dosage. Nagtataka pa tayo ngayon, or ang tanong natin ngayon is, what will be the dosage that we will recommend to the buyers so that this pill will be very effective? So, as the developers of this pill, let's say we are thinking whether to recommend our buyers to take this pill once a day or twice a day. Sa Tagalog, ano ba ang dosage na mas magiging effective yung pill? Is taking the pill once a day enough, or is it better to take the pill twice a day for maximum results? So that will be our research question. Is taking knowledge pill twice a day more effective in increasing intelligence than taking it once a day? So let's pause a little bit and then reviewin ulit natin what will be your IV, the levels, and the DV. So pause the video and then answer it to yourself. What will be the IV, the levels, and the DV? Ready? Pause the video now. The IV in this question would be the pill, or I would name it the knowledge pill. The levels would be taking the pill once a day or taking the pill twice a day. The dependent variable of this would be intelligence. Operational definition of intelligence, kayo nang bahala dyan, but if I am the experimenter, I would set it to the subject's performance in a standardized test. Okay, so those are the IV, the levels, the DV, and the operational definition of the dependent variable. What will be the general steps? If you are going to run this experiment, ano yung mga steps na kinakailangan mong i-take to answer that question? So more or less, it will run this way. You find participants, let's say 20, and then you divide them into two groups. First group will take the pill twice a day. Second group will take the pill once a day. And then you give them a test, and then you compare the scores. Make sense? I think it makes sense. Okay? So 20 people, hinati mo sa dalawa, twice a day, once a day, then ikumpara mo kung sino ang mas magpe-perform ng maayos. Now, hypothetical results. Let's say, those people who took the pill twice a day, meron silang 95% correct answers, and those people who took the pill once a day, 75% correct answers. Given these numbers, obviously, ang conclusion mo, taking the pill twice a day will be more effective. Taking the pill twice a day causes better performance in improving one's intelligence. So yan ngayon ang i-recommend mo sa mga buyers mo for maximum results. You take this pill, you take the knowledge pill twice a day. Again, that was an example of a true experiment. Paano mo nasabi or paano ba natin nasabi that that experiment is a true experiment? Did you catch it? What will make a psychological experiment a true experiment? Remember this, the trademark of a true experiment is direct control of the IV levels. If the experimenter has a direct control of the IV levels, it will make that experiment a true experiment. Now, when can we say that the experimenter has a direct control of the IV levels? Diba? Yan yung magandang tanong eh. Paano mo masasabi or kailan mo masasabi that the experimenter has a direct control of the IV levels? Here's the main indicator. The manipulation can be induced by the experimenter. In other words, kapag yung IV levels, yung experimenter yung nagbigay nun, it was the experimenter who made the IV levels possible, then we can say that the experimenter has direct control of the IV levels. Going back to our experiment, diba, yung IV natin will be the knowledge pill or frequency of the knowledge pill. Levels twice a day, once a day. Key question, who influenced the participants in this experiment to take the pill twice a day or to take it once a day? The answer, it was the experimenter. Yung experimenter yung nagdikta. The experimenter had the power to make the participants take the pill twice a day or once a day. In other words, in this experiment, the experimenter had direct control of the IV levels, which makes this a true experiment. Again, the key word here is direct control of the IV levels by the experimenter. Let me give you another example of an experiment considered a true experiment kasi merong direct control yung experimenter. Let's say ito yung ating question. Does sleeping at exactly 8 p.m. cause more positive mood than sleeping at exactly 11 p.m.? Again, pause the video and then answer the following questions. What will be the IV, the levels, the DV, and the operational definition of the DV? The IV level in this experiment would be the sleep time. What time will you sleep? Levels would be 2 levels, 8 p.m., 11 p.m. Dependent variable would be positive mood. How can I operationally define positive mood? The best way is to give these people a psychological test that measures positive mood. Okay? So let's now again run the experiment. Ready? The following are the steps. Number 1, or step 1, find subjects, let's say 20 subjects, and then we divide them into 2 groups. The first group will sleep 8 p.m., the second group will sleep 11 p.m. Sabihin natin, they are going to do this for 1 week. So for the first group, every day for 7 days, they sleep exactly 8 p.m. The second group, every day for the next 7 days, they will sleep 11 p.m. At the end of the experiment, at the end of the 7th day, we are now going to measure their overall mood through a psychological test. And then, we compare the scores kung sino ba ang mas positive yung mood. Let's say again, hypothetical result, ito yung ating results. 8 p.m. group, level 9 positive mood based on the test, and 11 p.m. group had level 4 positive mood based on the test. What will you conclude? Mas maganda ang natutulog ng maaga to generate positive mood. So that's the conclusion. Alright, the conclusion is the 8 p.m. group or sleeping at 8 p.m. will cause more positive mood. Again, that experiment na sinabi ko sa inyo is considered a true experiment. What made that a true experiment? Again, going back, let's look at the IV levels, the 8 p.m. and the 11 p.m. The sleep time, the sleep times, these 2 sleep times are our IV levels. Key question, who made the participants sleep at 8 p.m.? Who made them sleep at 11 p.m.? The answer, the experimenter. Merong direct control yung experimenter sa IV levels. It was the experimenter who induced participants to either sleep 8 p.m. or 11 p.m. So in this experiment, we can say merong direct control yung experimenter sa IV levels, which makes this experiment a true experiment. Now, let's go to the other type of experiment, the quasi experiment. What will make an experiment a quasi experiment? Again, let's start with an example. Halimbawa, ito yung tanong natin. Which children are more likely to suffer from low self-esteem? Are the physically abused children or the sexually abused children? Ito is it's a very clinical psychology question, no? In a way, we would like to know the impact of abuse to self-esteem. between physical abuse and sexual abuse, alin doon sa dalawa ang mas matindi ang epekto sa self-esteem. So again, pause the video and then answer the following questions. What's your IV? What will be the levels? What's the dependent variable? And the operational definition of your DV. The IV in this experiment would be the abuse or the type of abuse. Levels would be 2 levels, physical abuse and sexual abuse. Dependent variable will be self-esteem. Operational definition of self-esteem, marami namang mga psychological tests that we can use to measure the self-esteem in this study. Now, let's talk about the steps. How are you going to do this? Hypothetically, this is how you're going to do this. General steps. Step 1, let's find 20 subjects. Step 2, we divide them into 2 groups. The first group will be physically abused and the second group will be sexually abused. And then, let's find out kung anong magiging epekto nun sa kanilang self-esteem. By now, I'm sure you find this experiment weird and at the same time unethical. In fact, this is not the correct way on how to do this experiment, right? This is entirely wrong. Why? Because of ethical consideration. Diba? Hindi pwedeng kukuha ka na lang ng 20 na bata, i-divide mo sila sa dalawa, the first group will be physically abused and the second group will be sexually abused. That is the wrong way to do this because of ethical principle. You cannot hurt your participants this way. You cannot just hurt people physically and hurt people sexually and then find out how will that affect their self-esteem. Kapag ginawa mo tong experiment na ito, makukulong ka and at the same time, if you are a licensed psychologist, mawawala ang license mo. Again, remember, one of the qualities of a good experiment is it must be ethical. There should be no form of ethical violation. In this case, if you do the experiment this way, there is clearly an ethical violation. Now, going back to this experimental question, so papaano na? What if we really want to know the answer to this question? How can we really confirm that there is a difference in the effect of self-esteem depending whether the person was sexually abused or physically abused? Can we still pursue this experiment? The answer is yes. Meron pa ring paraan para masagot natin yung tanong dito. And how will we do it? This is the right way to do it. First step, we find participants who are already physically abused and participants who are already sexually abused. Did you get the difference compared to the first set of steps? Dito, humanap na tayo ng mga participants na ganun na sila. They were already physically abused, they were already sexually abused. In other words, the levels here are already pre-existing. And after we find these two groups, we compare their self-esteem by giving them a test on self-esteem and then we compare kung sino ang mas mababa ang self-esteem. Okay? So for example, again, hypothetical results, the sexually abused, ang self-esteem nila is at number 2, while the physically abused, their self-esteem is at 5. So what will be your conclusion? Your conclusion would be, mas matindi ang epekto sa self-esteem ng sexually abused kumpara sa physically abused. So when we talk about the damage that the abuse creates in the self-esteem, sexually abused is worse than physically abused. Well, of course, pareho naman silang masama, but based on the data, it seems like those people who are sexually abused have lower self-esteem compared to those people who are physically abused. Okay? So, that is an example of a quasi-experiment. Now, key question again, what made this experiment a quasi-experiment? The trademark of a quasi-experiment is the experimenter had no direct control of the IV levels. Walang direct control yung experimenter doon sa IV levels. In other words, the IV levels cannot be induced by the experimenter. The IV levels are already pre-existing. It is already pre-existing. Hindi yung experimenter yung gumawa ng IV levels. It was not the experimenter who induced the IV levels to the participants. The participants are already that way even before the experiment started. So the question now is, if these levels are not created by the experimenter, if these levels are not induced by the experimenter, who does? Sino ngayon ang gumawa ng IV levels? Dalawa lang naman yan chance or nature. In other words, in quasi experiments, the participants are already grouped even before the experiment started by who? By chance or by nature. Some examples of levels under quasi experiments would be the following levels, right? Halimbawa, yung levels mo, age. You have adolescents and you have young adults. It was not the experimenter who will make participants an adolescent or who will make participants adults. Participants are already adolescents, participants are already adults. Another common quasi-experiment IV levels would be sex. Diba? Halimbawa, male and female. It was not the experimenter who made participants male or female. The participants are already male or female even before the experiment started. The same thing with geographical location, nationality, race, or even natural events. Let's say yung levels mo would be those who experience earthquakes versus those who did not experience earthquakes. Right? I mean, participants are already that way. Hindi, the experimenter has no power to create an earthquake to make this a true experiment. Diba? The participants either already experienced earthquake or did not experience earthquake. And you know, given our times right now, another IV level, which I think is a very interesting topic to study during the pandemic, is our pandemic right now, no? Who experienced coronavirus versus who did not experience coronavirus. Let's say, for example, you would like to know personality differences before coronavirus and after coronavirus. In that case, people are already grouped, right? People are already grouped between those who had coronavirus versus those who don't have coronavirus. Am I making sense? Let's say, for example, your question is, are there any personality differences between those people who experienced coronavirus and those who did not? Diba? In that experiment, you cannot induce coronavirus to someone and then not induce coronavirus to the control group. That will be unethical. Hindi pwedeng mamimigay ka ng coronavirus para lang mapatakbo yung experiment mo. So in that case, what you would like to do is find people who already experienced coronavirus and compare their personality to people who have not yet experienced coronavirus. In that way, you are doing a quasi-experiment. Again, why? Because it was not you. It was not the experimenter who decides who gets the coronavirus and who does not get the coronavirus. Subjects are already grouped. Subjects are already pre-existing. Those who had coronavirus and those who don't have coronavirus, they were already grouped that way even before the experiment started. Now, let's talk about this question. Very important. Why is it called quasi in the first place? Kapag tumingin ka sa dictionary, ang ibig sabihin pala ng quasi is seemingly, apparently but not really, partly, or almost. In other words, when you say quasi-experiment, these are experiments but in a lower level. Seemingly lang. Apparently lang. Kumbaga, my best analogy here would be, it is like a class A version of an experiment. Di ba parang rubber shoes? Meron kang original version of the rubber shoes, pero meron ka ring class A version of a rubber shoes. The class A is not exactly the original, but it's close to it. But between the class A and the original has more value compared to the class A rubber shoes. The same thing with experiments. In quasi-experiments, true experiments are the higher version of the quasi-experiment. True experiments are more valuable than quasi-experiments when it comes to validity. Kumbaga, when it comes to the validity of the conclusion, people are more likely, or I mean psychologists, are more likely to believe conclusions coming from true experiments compared to conclusions coming from quasi-experiments. Why is that? Bakit mas mataas yung value ng conclusion from true experiments than quasi-experiments? We are going to answer that as we go along. But for the meantime, what you have to remember is quasi-experiments are not exactly experiments, but it seems like they are also experiments. Anyway, going back to the example, no? Which children are more likely to suffer from low self-esteem? Are the physically abused or the sexually abused? Why is this considered a quasi-experiment? Let me repeat, because the experimenter had no direct control of the IV levels. And the reason is, we cannot control the IV levels because of ethical considerations. Again, we cannot just get participants and physically abuse them or sexually abuse them and find out how will that affect their self-esteem. That is going to be unethical. The groupings of the IV levels in this experiment are already induced. They are already grouped that way even before the experiment started. Now, another question that I would like to throw away is this. So what if we cannot manipulate the IV levels in quasi-experiments? Is that an issue in doing experiments? Remember, in quasi-experiments, we are not manipulating the IV levels. The IV levels in quasi-experiments are already pre-existing. Key question is, so what? Ano ngayon? Ano ngayon ang issue kung hindi natin ma-manipulate ng direkta yung ating IV levels? Importante yan because meron itong implication in random assignment. That's very important. Get your notes and then I would like you to write down those words. Random assignment. Random assignment is a very important term in doing psychological experiments. And the thing is, what do you mean by random assignment? In random assignment, each subject had an equal chance of being assigned to any of the levels. Okay? Now, stay with me right here. Look at the slide. Imagine, remember, in a psychological experiment, you need people to participate in your experiment. Imagine in this experiment, you have two levels. You have two IV levels, the treatment group and the control group. Okay? Let's say we have 6 people willing to participate in our experiment. Now, how are we going to apply random assignment in psychological experiments? Simple. We get the names of the 6 people here, and then what do? We randomly pick their names so that we know who goes to which group. So the first person I pick goes to the treatment group, the second person I pick goes to the control group, the third person I pick goes to the treatment group, the fourth person I pick goes to the control group, hanggang maubos yung 6. In that way, in that system, if you notice, each of the 6 participants in this experiment had an equal chance of being assigned to either treatment group or control group. Specifically, 50-50%. Tama? Probability-wise. If you are one of the 6 participants here, meron kang 50% chance of being in the treatment group, another 50% chance of being assigned in the control group. That's what you mean by random assignment. All participants had an equal chance of being assigned to any of the levels. Now, you connect that idea to the essence of a true experiment versus a quasi-experiment. You can easily do random assignment in true experiment, right? But you cannot do that in quasi-experiment. Again, to connect the idea. In quasi-experiment, the IV levels are already predetermined. Hindi ikaw ang gumawa ng IV levels. They were already grouped that way. So there is no point for you to practice random assignment because the participants are already grouped. Okay, now, let me show you a diagram to further explain to you how this works, okay? How do we do random assignment? Usually, we do a fishbowl technique. In fishbowl technique, what do? We get the names of all the participants, and then we put their names in a fishbowl, and then we pick their names. The first person I pick goes to level 1, second person I pick goes to level 2 again. This is what we do in true experiments. And in true experiments, again, remember, the IV levels we control. We have a direct control of the IV levels. That's why we can do this. So for the sake of illustration, again, let's do the fishbowl technique. Okay, ready? The first person I pick goes to level 1. The second person goes to level 2. Third person goes to level 1. Next person goes to level 2. Again, I am picking up their names. The next name I pick goes to level 1. The next name I pick goes to level 2 hanggang maubos ko yung pangalan doon sa aking fishbowl. Again, in this system, all participants had an equal chance of being assigned to either level 1 or level 2. 50%, 50%. You apply that strategy in my opening example about the knowledge pill. Who are the participants who will take the pill once a day versus twice a day? We will apply the fishbowl technique. So the first person I pick will take the pill once a day. The second person I pick will take the pill twice a day, so on and so forth until maubos ko yung laman ng aking fishbowl. You see the system? Again, in this type of strategy, all participants had an equal chance of being assigned to once a day or twice a day. Meron silang 50%, 50% chance of being assigned to either of the levels. Random assignment is not possible, again, in quasi experiments. Going back to my example of self-esteem of physically abused and sexually abused children, hindi mo sila pwedeng i-random assignment to the different levels because they are already grouped in the first place. They are already grouped. So there is no point of putting their names in a fishbowl, tapos yung unang bubunutin mo pupunta sa sexually abused, yung pangalawang bubunutin mo pupunta sa physically abused. They are already grouped. So the thing is, logically, after you identify who are sexually abused versus who are physically abused, that's it. Now, the next step is to measure the dependent variable. Bibigyan mo na ngayon sila ng self-esteem scale. Hindi ka na magra-random assignment. Hindi ka na mag-fishbowl technique because again, paulit-ulit na ako, no? Again, they are already grouped in the first place. The IV levels are already pre-existing. They are already sexually abused or physically abused even before your experiment started. Now, go back to your real-life experiment. Sa tingin nyo ba, yung ginawa nyo doon sa assignment nyo that you submitted to me, is that a form of a true experiment or a quasi-experiment? Actually, in my guess is, a lot of you, majority of you, had done a true experiment. Right? Why? Because I believe your IV levels in that experiment, you had direct control. Right? Meron kayo kasi yung experimenter, doon kayo yung nag-control ng IV levels. Did you drink coffee or not drink coffee? Did you watch TV or not watch TV? Did you watch Netflix for 2 hours versus you watch Netflix for 1 hour? It was you who is controlling the IV levels. And as I browsed through your assignments, I think marami talagang mga students gumawa ng true experiment. Okay? So that's the difference between the true experiment and quasi-experiment. Now, let me just close this lecture with this very important question. What's with random assignment? Bakit ngayon issue yan? Remember, I asked you to write down the words random assignment on your notes because it is a very important term in experimental psychology. Why is random assignment so important? Why is it an issue that you can do random assignment in true experiment and not in quasi-experiment? Actually, di ba sabi ko kanina, mas mataas ang value ng true experiment versus quasi-experiment. One of the reasons bakit? Because you can do random assignment in true experiments but not in quasi-experiments. Which means, can you connect the idea so far? Which means, there is something about random assignment that it increases the value of true experiments more than quasi-experiments. Ang tanong ngayon, ano yun? What is with random assignment that it increases the value of an experiment? We will talk about that as we go along. Okay, we are going to answer that question in the next lecture video. So I hope you learned the difference so far between true experiments and quasi experiments. So just to formally close our lecture discussion for today, I would like you to answer the following items. In this exercise, mabilis lang ang gagawin ninyo, no? Given the following descriptions, I would like you to decide if this experiment will be a true experiment, will be a quasi experiment, or it can be both true or quasi experiments. I would like you to make use of your common sense and critical thinking. Okay? Numbers 1 to 7. Number 1, random assignment is not possible. Ano yan? True, quasi, or both? Number 2, IV can be directly controlled. True, quasi, or both? Number 3, groups were created by nature. True, quasi, or both? Number 4, fishbowl technique can be used. True, quasi, or both? Number 5, subject had a chance to be in group A or group B. Is that true, quasi, or both? Number 6, IV has 2 levels. True, quasi, or both? Typo lang yung have, no? Dapat to has because IV is singular. My apologies. Number 7, presence of dependent variable. Is that true experiment, quasi experiment, or it can happen in both true or quasi experiment? How about number 8? Levels. If your levels are this, drink 3 glasses of water and drink 7 glasses of water, is that true, quasi, or both? Number 9, let's say your levels are the following: experience martial law and did not experience martial law. Is that true, quasi, or it can happen in both? Number 10, the following are my levels: cold room and hot room. Is that true, quasi, or both? So we are going to answer this exercise the next time we meet live. For the meantime, get your notebook, and then that's where you write down your answers from numbers 1 to 10, and we will discuss this in the next live session. Thank you for listening, and then I'll see you next time. God bless.